She hummed while walking in the castle kitchens. Then the Alpha King's wolves gathered beneath her window. The pot slipped from Mora's hands and hit the stone floor with a crash that echoed through the entire kitchen. She grabbed it before the water could spread too far, her knuckles white from the grip, her heart already hammering. Not because of the pot. Not because of the noise. But because she had just heard the head housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, say her name in a tone that meant one thing: she was about to be let go. Mora was 19 years old. She had been working in the kitchens of Ashford Castle for 11 months. Before that, she had worked at a dairy farm 2 villages over, and before that, a laundry service in a small town at the edge of the Highlands. She had moved from job to job since she was 16, not because she was unreliable, but because the work always ran out eventually, budgets tightened, seasons ended, families moved on. She had learned not to expect permanence. She had not learned how to stop hoping for it. "I said your name," Mrs. Crane repeated, stepping fully into the scullery. She was a tall woman with iron gray hair and a voice shaped by decades of giving orders. She looked at Mora the way most people in that castle looked at her, like she was temporary. "There is a pile of copper pots in the east corridor that have not been polished in 3 weeks. You will have them done before supper. Do you understand?" Mora exhaled. Not let go. Just reprimanded. She nodded once, said yes, and went back to scrubbing without another word. That was how most of her days went. Instructions delivered, instructions followed, silence in between. She did not complain. She did not argue. She had learned early that argument was a luxury for people with somewhere else to go. Mora did not have somewhere else to go. The single room at the top of the castle service wing, which smelled of old stone and lavender soap, was the closest thing she had to a home. She guarded it carefully. But there was one thing she could not keep entirely to herself. The humming. It started as a habit, something so deeply embedded in her that she did not always notice when she was doing it. Her mother had hummed constantly, over the stove, over the garden beds, over Mora's hair when she plaited it each morning. After her mother died, when Mora was 12, the humming had moved from her mother's lips to her own, as though it needed to live somewhere and had chosen her. It was not singing. She never sang words. It was a sound more like breathing set to rhythm, low and unbroken, something she did without thinking when her hands were busy and her mind had gone somewhere private. In the castle kitchen, she hummed over the pots. She hummed while she chopped and carried and scrubbed. The other kitchen staff barely noticed anymore. They had long since decided she was strange and stopped trying to understand her. Only the young kitchen boy, a 10-year-old named Oliver who had been brought in from the village to help with deliveries, ever commented on it. He told her once, very seriously, that it sounded like the noise the hills made before rain. She had not known what to say to that, so she said nothing. But she thought about it for days afterward. It was the 3rd week of October when things began to change. The autumn had come down hard and fast that year. The hills around Ashford had turned amber and rust overnight, and the morning smelled of frost before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. Mora was working alone in the scullery just before 5 in the morning, a task she had claimed without being asked because the early hours were quiet and the quiet belonged to her. She was humming, the same low, looping sound she always made, when she saw movement through the narrow window above the stone sink. She turned. Her hands stilled in the water. 3 wolves stood in the frozen grass outside the window. They were large, pale-furred, and completely still. Their eyes were forward, their ears high. They looked, she thought, as though they were listening. For a long moment, nobody moved. Mora looked at the wolves. The wolves looked at Mora. Then, slowly, she began to hum again. One of the wolves lowered itself to the ground. It rested its chin on its front paws and watched her through the glass. She did not call for anyone. She did not back away from the window. She stood at the stone sink with her hands in the cold water and hummed until the sky began to lighten, and by the time the rest of the kitchen staff began to arrive, the wolves had gone. She said nothing about it. She told herself it had been a strange morning and that strange mornings passed like all others. But 2 days later, they were back. 5 of them this time, gathered in the frosted grass just beneath the kitchen window in the pale dark before dawn. She had heard nothing, no pause on gravel, no sound at all. They had simply appeared, the way things sometimes do in the Highlands, silently and with complete certainty about their right to be there. She stood at the window and looked at them for a long time. Then she went back to work, and she hummed, and the wolf stayed until the light came. Nobody believed her when she finally mentioned it. Oliver believed her immediately, with the full confidence of a 10-year-old who had grown up hearing stories about these hills. The senior cook, a man named George who had worked at Ashford for over 2 decades, told her she had probably seen deer. A groundskeeper named Phil, who came in for tea each morning, told her it was unlikely but not impossible, since the estate did have wolves. The owner's rewilding project had been running for years. But Phil looked at her with the cautious expression of someone who was choosing his words carefully, and when she asked why he looked so uncertain, he changed the subject. She did not push. She went back to the scullery. She washed the copper pot until her arms ached. She hummed, because there was nothing else to do, and because the sound of it was the only thing in the world that felt entirely and permanently hers. By the end of the week, there were 7 wolves beneath her window. By the following Sunday morning, she counted 12. She stood in her room at the top of the service wing and looked down at them in the snow, and for the first time in years, she felt something she did not have a word for, something that sat between wonder and fear and was neither one fully, but something warmer than both. She did not know that someone else was watching too. She did not know that photographs had been taken, or that those photographs had traveled through 3 sets of hands before landing on the desk of the one person in the castle who rarely looked at anything and almost never came downstairs. She did not know that in the morning, everything was going to change. She only stood at the window, looked down at the wolves, and hummed. And the wolves, every one of them, lay down in the snow as though they were exactly where they were meant to be. The photographs were placed on Callum's desk at 7 in the morning by Boyd, his land manager, who said nothing beyond a quiet knock and a careful step backward out of the room. Boyd had worked for Callum for 9 years. He had learned that knocking was enough, that silence was often the correct response, and that anything worth discussing could wait until Callum had looked at whatever had been brought to him. Callum was already awake. He was almost always already awake. He sat at the wide oak desk in his study on the 2nd floor, a room that faced not the castle's front drive but the hills, always the hills, with a mug of black tea that had gone cold and a map he had been annotating for the better part of an hour. He was 41 years old. He had not left the estate in 6 weeks. People who did not know him described him as reclusive. The word irritated him, not because it was untrue, but because it implied that he was hiding. He was not hiding. He simply had no interest in the things that required living. The estate was 6,000 acres of rewooded highland terrain, ancient forest, open moorland, 3 freshwater lochs, and a river system that had taken 7 years to restore. There was more to do here on any given day than he could reasonably finish in a lifetime. He did not feel the absence of other places. He picked up the photographs. There were 11 of them, printed on plain paper by the estate security office, time-stamped from the past 12 days. In each one, wolves, his wolves, were gathered near the eastern wall of the castle. In some photographs it was 3 or 4 animals. In later photographs it was 8, 9, 12. All of them facing the same direction. All of them calm. Callum set the photographs down and looked at the hills. His wolves did not approach the castle. This was not a rule he had imposed, it was simply the way things had always been. The pack kept to the rewooded ground, moving through the northern woodland and across the moorland in patterns he had studied and mapped for years. They came close to the outer estate walls sometimes, in winter especially, when the deer herds moved south. But they did not gather. They did not stay in one place without reason. And they certainly did not lay themselves down in the snow beneath a window like sleeping dogs. Something had changed. And whatever it was, it had started 12 days ago. He pulled on his coat and went downstairs. The kitchen was already running when he reached it. The sound of it came to him before he got to the door, the knock of heavy pots, the hiss of something on the stove, and beneath all of it, something else. A sound so quiet he almost missed it. Low. Continuous. rising and falling like a tide. He stopped in the corridor outside the kitchen door. He stood there for a full minute, just listening. He could not have said why he didn't move. The sound was simple, not music exactly, not words, just a low, breathing kind of hum that seemed to have no beginning and no end, as though it had always been there and he had only just come close enough to hear it. He pushed open the door. A young woman stood at the stone sink with her back to him, washing something in the deep basin. She was slight, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come partially loose, and she was humming, softly, steadily, without any apparent awareness that she was doing it. She did not turn around. She did not hear him over the sound of the water and the rest of the kitchen's noise. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. Then he asked Boyd, who had followed him, as Boyd always did, who she was. Boyd told him her name was Mara. She had been with the kitchen staff for almost a year. She was 19. She worked the early hours, mostly alone. She was, Boyd said carefully, the one the wolves had been coming to. Callum walked across the kitchen to the window above the scullery sink. He looked out at the eastern wall. The grass was empty in the morning light, frost still white on the ground, no sign of any animal. He turned back to look at the young woman at the sink. She had still not noticed him. Then she turned to set something on the drying board and saw him standing there. She did not flinch. She did not apologize or look startled. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they were half expecting, and she said, very simply and without any preamble, they were here again this morning. Before dawn. If you'd come an hour earlier, you could have seen them. He did not know what he had expected her to say. It was not that. How many? He asked. 8, she said. The big pale one was at the front. She lay down first. The others followed. He nodded slowly. The big pale female was the pack's dominant animal, a wolf he had named Lena in his field notes, a name he had never told anyone. She was 7 years old, highly intelligent, and almost impossible to observe at close range. She had never allowed a handler within 20 feet of her. She had never, in 7 years, shown the slightest interest in the castle building. He stayed in the kitchen for 40 minutes that morning. He asked moral questions about what she had seen, and she answered each one plainly, without embellishment, without nervousness. She did not ask him who he was. She seemed to already know, or perhaps she simply did not find it as significant as most people did. He noticed that she kept working the entire time, drying pots, stacking dishes, preparing the trays for the morning service, as though his presence required no special adjustment to her routine. He left without telling her what he planned to do about it. He went back to his study and sat down and looked at the photographs again. Then he picked up his phone and called a researcher he had worked with at the University of Edinburgh, a woman named Dr. Laura Field, who studied animal behavior and had contributed data to his rewarding project 2 years earlier. He told her what was happening. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, a specific person. One specific person the wolves are drawn to. Consistently, he said. 12 days. Growing numbers. The dominant female is among them. I'll come next week, Dr. Field said. And then, before he could respond, she added, Callum, this is extraordinary. Do you understand that? This doesn't happen. He hung up the phone and looked out at the hills. He thought about the sound he had heard in the corridor outside the kitchen, that low, unbroken hum that had stopped him in his tracks without his fully understanding why. He thought about the way it had felt to stand there listening, the strange stillness it had produced in him, something he had not felt in a long time. He told himself it was the scientific question that interested him. The animal behavior. The data. That was the thing worth understanding. He made himself believe it for almost 2 weeks. The wolves came every morning without fail. Mara's routine did not change. She arrived before 5, walked in the scullery, hummed without thinking about it, and looked out the window when she felt the quiet change in a way she had begun to recognize. She could feel them before she saw them. She did not know how to explain it, so she did not try. She only looked, and they were there. Callum began coming to the kitchen in the mornings. He did not announce it. He simply appeared, coat still on, tea in hand, and stood at the window or asked a quiet question about what she had observed. She answered him the same way each time, directly and without fuss. He appreciated this more than he could easily say. Most people softened their speech around him, reached for formality, treated his presence like something requiring management. Moro did not manage him. She spoke to him the way she would speak to anyone, and it made something in his chest settle in a way he found both unfamiliar and deeply welcome. Dr. Field arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of November. She was a small, precise woman with a recorder always in her hand, and she spent the first morning simply sitting in the kitchen in silence, listening. She recorded Mora humming during the early work hours and played the audio back 3 times before she said anything to anyone. What she said was directed at Callum, and she said it in a low voice while Mora was across the room. The frequency is unusual. Not abnormal, not outside the human range, but it sits in a register that's close to the infrasound threshold. Some animals are sensitive to it in ways we're still documenting. It may be that she produces a harmonic in that register without knowing it. Something that registers as calm or safe to the wolves, rather than as threat. Callum looked across the kitchen at Mora, who was lifting a heavy pot off the range without any appearance of effort. She has no idea she's doing anything, he said. Most people with this kind of quality never do, Dr. Field said. It's not a skill. It's just her. He watched Mora carry the pot to the sink. She had started humming again without realizing it, the way she always did when her hands were full and her attention was on the work. He thought about what it must be like to carry something so particular inside you, something that moved wolves without effort or intention, something you had been doing your whole life without knowing it mattered. He thought, very carefully, about what it might be like to know her better. And then he thought about something else, something he had been almost successfully not thinking about for the past 2 weeks. The way the wolves had chosen her. The way they had gathered and waited and laid themselves down. In all his years of working with animals, Callum had seen trust built slowly, through patience and repetition and unfamiliarity. He had never seen an animal simply arrive at trust the way his pack had arrived at Mora, immediately, collectively, and completely. He had a thought that he pushed away quickly but that came back the following morning, and the morning after that the wolves had recognized something in her that he was only beginning to understand himself. That whatever it was worth paying attention to. The data from the first week alone was enough to make Dr. Laura Field forget to eat lunch, which, according to everyone who knew her, had never happened before in her professional life. She had set up a field station in one of the estate's spare rooms, a narrow, north-facing room that she had covered wall-to-wall with her observation notes, audio files, and printed charts. By the end of day 3, Callum had started leaving his study after dinner and coming to stand in her doorway just to look at the data. He did not say much. He did not need to. The number spoke clearly enough. Each morning, between 4:40 and 5:15, when Mora began her early shift in the scullery, the pack moved. Dear. Field had placed motion-activated cameras along the pack's usual corridor, the stretch of northern woodland that brought them closest to the castle grounds, and the footage showed the same pattern every single morning. The wolves would be resting, scattered in the way a pack at scatters, and then something would shift. One would lift its head. Then another. Then within minutes, all of them were moving toward the eastern wall. Not all at once. Never in a rush. They moved the way water moves toward a low point, naturally, without urgency, as though they were simply going somewhere they had already decided was right. The dominant female, the pale wolf Callum called Lena in his field notes, always arrived first. She would position herself at the front of the group, facing the castle wall, and lie down. The others arranged themselves around her. They stayed, on average, until the sky lightened and the kitchen sounds changed, more voices, more movement, less of the single quiet presence that had drawn them there. Dr. Field captured Mora's humming in 11 separate audio sessions across the first 2 weeks of her stay. She ran each recording through a frequency analyzer and found what she had suspected from her first morning in the kitchen, a harmonic in the low end of Mora's vocal range that sat at the edge of the infrasound register. Not true infrasound, nothing outside the range of human hearing, but close enough to produce a vibration that certain animals could perceive at a lower level of consciousness than sound. Not heard exactly. Felt. She explained this to Callum one evening in the field station, with the audio file open on the laptop between them. She played a segment of Mara humming and pointed to the frequency display on the screen. Animals perceive infrasound as environmental information, she said. Storms. Seismic shifts. Predator presence at a distance. It's a survival signal. But the pattern Mara produces is rhythmic and continuous. It's the opposite of an alarm. It reads, in a sense, as evidence that nothing is wrong. That the environment is stable. Safe. So she calms them, Callum said. She calms them in a way their own biology is tuned to respond to, Dr. Field said. It's not training. It's not communication exactly. It's more like she speaks something they already know how to hear. Callum was quiet for a moment. He looked at the frequency display on the screen, at the low, steady wave that was the shape of Mara's voice doing what it always did without her knowledge. Has she seen any of this? He asked. Not yet, Dr. Field said. I thought you might want to be there when she does. He thought about this. About what it would mean for Mara to see herself, the part of herself she had always simply carried, laid out in data on a screen. He thought about the expression on her face in the mornings when she looked out the window and found the wolves there, that look of quiet wonder she never tried to perform or explain. He told Dear Field he would bring her to the field station the following evening. He went to find Mara himself. This was not something he would ordinarily have done. There were people on the estate whose job it was to communicate with staff, and he had not handled a routine conversation personally in longer than he could easily remember. He went anyway. She was in the scullery at 4:30 in the afternoon, finishing a task she had apparently taken on during her own time because the copper rack on the wall was clearly a project in progress. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway and said nothing, which he had come to understand was her way of indicating that she was listening. He said Dr. Field had findings she would like to share. He said he thought Mara would want to hear them. He said it in a careful way, making it clear that she was not required to come, that this was an invitation and not an instruction. She wiped her hands on a cloth and said, Now. Tomorrow evening, he said. She nodded. She went back to the copper rack. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, and then he left. The following evening she sat in the field station across from the laptop, and Dr. Field walked her through everything, the motion footage, the timing data, the frequency analysis, all of it. Mara watched without saying anything for a long time. She watched the footage of the wolves moving through the dark, that steady purposeful drift toward the castle wall. She watched the frequency display and listened to the clip of herself humming and looked at the wave pattern on the screen. That's what I do, she said finally. She said it without any particular emotion, not pride, not embarrassment. Just clarity, as though a thing she had not understood before had simply come into focus. That's what you do, Dr. Field said. Mara looked at the screen for another moment. Then she said, My mother used to do it too. The humming. She said her mother had done it before her. Dr. Field looked at Callum. He was watching Mara. Did your mother have any unusual relationships with animals? Dr. Field asked. Mara thought about this carefully. Then she said, The dogs in our street used to follow her home sometimes. She used to say they were just hoping for scraps. But she never gave them any. No one said anything for a moment after that. The field station was quiet. Outside, the early dark of a November night had already settled over the hills. I'd like to try something, Dr. Field said. If you're willing. I'd like to bring you out to the woodland, to the park's usual range, and simply observe what happens. Nothing structured. Just you, and the land, and we record whatever the wolves do. Mara looked at Callum. He realized she was checking, in her quiet way, whether this was something he was comfortable with. It was his land. His wolves. She was asking his permission without asking it directly. I'll come with you, he said. It was not what he had planned to say. He had planned to say that it was entirely her choice and that Dr. Field was competent to manage the observation alone. But he said he would come, and he did not take it back. They went out the following morning before dawn, the three of them moving in single file along the edge of the tree line with torches angled at the ground. Dear Field had her equipment. Callum had his field binoculars. Mara had nothing, because she had nothing she needed to bring. They stopped at a clearing Callum had chosen, a wide, flat stretch of frost-hard ground where the northern woodland opened briefly before closing again. He had seen the park here before, in the quiet before the landscape started. He set a portable heat lamp at the edge of the tree line so Mara would not get cold, and then he and Dr. Field stepped back toward the trees. Mara sat down on the frozen ground without being asked. She sat with her knees loosely folded and her hands resting open in her lap, and she looked at the dark line of the woodland, and after a moment she began to hum. Callum stood at the tree line with his binoculars at his chest, not raised, not needed yet, and he listened. The sound moved through the cold air like something warm. It was difficult to describe in terms that made any scientific sense. It was low and continuous and entirely without urgency, and it made the dark seem less like an absence and more like a presence, the way a familiar room feels when the lights are off but you know it well. 6 minutes passed. He knew because he was counting. Then, from the far edge of the clearing, something white moved. Lena came out of the tree line alone. She walked without hesitation across the open ground toward Mara, stopped at a distance of roughly 12 feet, and sat down. She looked at Mara. Mara looked back at her. Neither of them moved. Then Lena lay down on the frost-hard ground, the same way she lay down beneath the castle window every morning, with her chin on her paws and her eyes fully open and entirely still. Dr. Field made a sound so small it was barely a breath. Callum said nothing. He did not move. He watched Lena, a wolf he had spent 7 years observing from distances of 30 meters or more, lying 6 meters from a 19-year-old kitchen worker who was humming the melody her mother had taught her and had absolutely no idea that what she was doing was extraordinary. The rest of the pack came out of the trees 20 minutes later. They moved slowly, in loose formation, and arranged themselves around Lena in the clearing. Mara stayed still. She kept humming. The wolf settled. At one point, one of the younger males, a 2-year-old Callum had been tracking for months, moved toward Mara and stopped less than 4 feet away. It looked at her for a long time. Then it lay down at her side. Callum took a breath. Held it. Let it out slowly. Dr. Field was recording everything. He knew the data would be clean, detailed, publishable, significant. He knew that what they were witnessing had genuine scientific value and that it would attract interest from people who would want to study it further, people who would want access to Mara and to his wolves and to this land. But that was not what he was thinking about. He was thinking about Mara sitting on the frozen ground in the dark with 12 wolves lying around her like she was the center of something they had already decided. He was thinking about the fact that she had not been startled, had not looked for him or for Dr. Field, had not needed any reassurance. She had simply been where she was, doing what she always did, and the world around her had arranged itself accordingly. He had spent 9 years building something on this land. He had planted trees and restored rivers and reintroduced species and studied data and worked through difficult years when the funding was uncertain and the progress was slow and the isolation was something he managed rather than enjoyed. He had done all of it with the careful, committed intelligence of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why it mattered. He had never once felt the way he felt watching Mara in that clearing. He did not try to name it. He was not ready to name it. He only stood at the tree line in the dark and watched and knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere below thought, that something was beginning. Not between a man and a woman, not yet, not simply that. Something larger and harder to categorize. The beginning of understanding that the thing he had been building here for 9 years had been waiting for someone to recognize it in a way he himself could not. And she had walked into his kitchen 11 months ago and started humming, and the land had known before he did. The journal that published Dr. Field's findings was not a public-facing outlet. It was a specialist publication for wildlife researchers and conservation scientists, the kind of journal read by people who already understood the weight of the word unprecedented. But even within that narrow readership, the response was immediate. Within 2 weeks of the paper's release, Dr. Field had received 47 emails. Within a month, a wildlife documentary production team had reached out to the estate. A behavioral science magazine ran a short piece summarizing the findings under a headline that used the phrase natural interspecies resonance, which Callum found technically accurate and slightly irritating in the way most simplified language was. 3 separate universities inquired about follow-up studies. 2 of them specifically asked whether the individual at the center of the observation would be available for further testing. He put those 2 emails aside and let them wait. He had not told Maura about any of it yet. He had told Dr. Field that he wanted to speak to Maura himself before any decisions were made about her involvement, and there. Field had agreed immediately, without question, because she was a decent person and because she understood that this was Callum's way of protecting someone who did not yet know she needed protecting. The question of how to have that conversation sat with him for several days. He was not, by nature, someone who struggled with direct communication. He said what needed to be said and expected others to do the same. But he was aware that what he needed to tell Maura was layered in a way that required some care, not only the fact that her name was now, in academic circles, attached to a genuinely significant finding, but also the possibility that this could change things for her in ways she had not chosen and might not want. He found her on a Saturday morning in early December, not in the kitchen but outside it, sitting on the low stone wall at the back of the castle with a mug of tea and her face turned toward the sun, which was making a cautious appearance between a long run of grey days. She looked, for a moment, the way he imagined she looked when she was not thinking about work or about the expectations of anyone around her, simply present, simply resting. He sat down on the wall beside her, which surprised her. He could see it in the brief stillness that passed across her face before she adjusted. He apologized for the interruption. She said it was no interruption. He told her about the journal. He told her about the emails. He told her about the documentary inquiry and the university request, and he watched her face as he explained it. Her expression did not change dramatically. She listened the way she always listened, entirely, without fidgeting, and when he finished, she looked down at her mug. "What do they want from me?" she asked. "Some of them want to do more testing," he said. "To study the frequency further. To understand whether the effect can be replicated in controlled conditions." "And you," she said. She looked at him directly when she said it. He had prepared for many questions. He had not entirely prepared for that one. "I think it's your decision," he said carefully. "All of it. I want you to understand that nothing about your situation here depends on what you decide. Your position on the estate is not conditional on your cooperation with any of this." She nodded. She seemed to be considering something. Then she said, "I don't want to be studied. I don't want people coming here to observe me like I'm a result. I don't want my name in anything public." "Then none of that will happen," he said. She looked at him again, and something in her expression shifted slightly, something careful that became slightly less careful. "You do that. Turn down all of it." "It's not my data," he said. "And it's not my life." She was quiet for a moment. The pale winter sun moved behind a cloud and the morning cooled around them. From somewhere across the eastern field came the distant sound of one of the groundskeepers starting a vehicle. "I'd like to keep walking," she said. "Just walking. I'd like the wolves to keep coming if they want to. And I'd like it not to become a thing that people talk about." "That is a reasonable set of requests," he said. She almost smiled. It was a small, contained thing, not the kind of smile that announced itself, but he noticed it. He had begun to notice most things about her, which was itself something worth acknowledging to himself even if he was not ready to do anything with the acknowledgement. He communicated the decision to Dr. Field that afternoon. "Dear." Field said she understood and that she would handle the inquiries. She said it without apparent disappointment, which he respected. She asked only one question, whether Callum himself would be willing to continue the observation work with her. He said yes. He said it immediately. He did not examine why he said it so immediately until later that evening, sitting in his study with the annotated maps and the cold tea, listening to the sound the castle made when most of the staff had gone to their rooms, that deep, old quiet that suited him, and thinking about a woman sitting on a stone wall with her face turned toward the winter sun. The observation work continued through December. He and Dr. Field went out 3 mornings a week before dawn, and Mora came with them, and the wolves came to the clearing, and the data continued to build. But the nature of those mornings changed as December deepened. Dr. Field was efficient and disciplined and fully focused on her work, which meant that the space around the walk out through the frost, the wait in the dark, the slow walk back when the sky had lightened, belonged to Callum and Mora in a way that neither of them had arranged and neither of them commented on. They walked side by side without planning to. They talked in low voices, the way you talk in the dark when the world is still and noise seems rude. He told her things about the land, the history of the rewilding project, the specific characters of individual wolves in the park, the years when the river had been running wrong and what it had taken to fix it. She listened and asked questions that were consistently better than the questions most adults asked him, more specific, more interested in the mechanism of things rather than the surface story. She told him things too. Not much, and not quickly, but steadily, the way the land revealed itself over time to people who paid attention. She told him about growing up in a small town at the edge of the highlands, about the sequence of jobs since she was 16, about what it felt like to be always arriving somewhere new with the knowledge that you might not stay. She told him that she had stopped expecting permanence a long time ago but that she had not stopped wanting it, and that these were two different things that she had learned to carry at the same time. He understood this. He had spent years carrying his own version of the same two things. One morning in the 3rd week of December, they were walking back from the clearing in a silence that had become, over the weeks, entirely comfortable, when she stopped and looked at something in the tree line. He stopped beside her. There was nothing there that he could see. But she was still an intent, and he had learned to trust that. After a moment she said, "There," and he raised his binoculars and found it, a young female wolf, barely more than a juvenile, standing alone at the very edge of the trees. Not one of the main pack. One of the peripheral animals he had been tracking but rarely sighting. "She's been watching us walk back every morning," Mora said. "She doesn't come to the clearing. But she's always there when we walk back." He lowered the binoculars. "How long have you noticed her?" "Since the 2nd week," she said. He had not noticed her once. He had 12 years of field experience and professional-grade equipment and a detailed knowledge of every animal on this land, and he had not seen what Mora had been seeing every morning for a month. He did not say this out loud. He only looked at the young wolf at the tree line, and then at Mora, who had gone back to walking and was humming again, very quietly, as though the observation had already passed from her mind and she was simply moving through the morning the way she moved through everything, with attention and without fuss. He caught up with her on the path back to the castle. They walked together in the cold December air, their breath visible, the frost still white on the ground, and he was aware, with a clarity that he no longer tried to argue himself out of, that he did not want these mornings to stop. Not because of the wolves. Not because of the data. Because of her. He did not say this. It was December, and she had just told him, not 2 weeks ago, that she had learned to stop expecting permanence. He was not going to be the thing that tested her on that. But he was aware of it, fully and without equivocation, and awareness was where everything in his life had always started. He left a book on the hook by her room that evening. A field guide to Highland flora, because she had mentioned once that she could not name the plants she saw in the mornings and wished that she could. He left it without a note, the way he had been leaving things for weeks, quietly and without attaching any expectation to the gesture. The following morning, there was a small sprig of dried heather on the kitchen windowsill. It had not been there the day before. He picked it up and held it and stood at the window looking out at the empty eastern wall, and something in his chest settled the way it settled sometimes when the land surprised him, when the river ran clear after a long winter, or when a species came back that he had thought might not. Something right, he thought. Something that was simply right. January came in with a hard freeze that locked the lock and drove the deer herd south across the moorland in long, restless columns. Callum watched them from the hill above the castle on New Year's morning, standing alone in the cold with his binoculars and his breath coming white around him, and he thought about the year that had just ended and the one that was beginning. He thought about the estate and the wolves and the rewarding work and everything that still needed doing. He thought about the data and the journal and the careful, ongoing question of what all of it meant in the larger picture of his work. And then, because he had stopped being able to help it, he thought about Mara. The documentary team had not given up. A producer named Colin had sent 3 increasingly polished emails explaining what the project would involve and how the estate and its work could benefit from their attention. Callum had read each email, noted that Colin was good at his job, and declined without particular warmth. 2 of the universities had also persisted. He had been more direct with them, though still polite, because Dr. Field had asked him to preserve the relationship for the sake of future collaboration. What he had not anticipated was the newspaper. A journalist named Alice, who had been given a very brief mention of the story by someone at the university, not Dear Field, who was careful, but someone further along the chain, had put together enough of the picture to write a short article. It ran in a Saturday supplement, 600 words with no photographs and no specific names, but with enough geographical detail that anyone who knew the region and paid attention would have little trouble identifying the estate. Boyd brought him the article on a Thursday morning, printed out, with the same quiet knock and careful step backward he always used for difficult news. Callum read it at his desk and felt a cold and specific irritation. The article was not inaccurate. It was not sensational. But it used phrases like mysterious attraction and the girl who speaks to wolves, and these phrases made him tighten his jaw in a way that had nothing to do with the scientific accuracy of the piece. He went to find Mara. She was in the kitchen, where she always was at that hour, walking alone with her sleeves pushed up and a pot of stock on the range. She looked up when he came in and read his expression immediately. He could tell because she set down what she was holding and gave him her full attention without being asked. He showed her the article. She read it standing at the kitchen counter. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him and said, "The girl who speaks to wolves." "Yes," he said. "I don't speak to them," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't." She set the paper down on the counter. She looked at it for another moment, and then she looked at him, and she said, "Are people going to come here?" "I don't know," he said. "There may be some interest. I want you to know that I handle it. You won't have to speak to anyone you don't want to speak to. No one will access this property without my knowledge, and no one will access you." She studied him for a moment. There was something in her expression that he had been learning to read over the course of the past weeks, a quality of attention that was not suspicious and not guarded but was very careful, the kind of care that comes from experience of things not quite working out. "Why?" she asked. "Because this is my estate," he said. "And because what happens here is my responsibility." She held his gaze for a moment. He had the feeling she was deciding something. Then she said, "All right," and she picked up the article and folded it carefully and set it to one side, and she went back to the pot on the range. He stayed in the kitchen longer than usual that morning. He told himself it was because he wanted to make sure she was all right, which was true. But he also stayed because the kitchen was warm and the morning was cold and she was humming again, very quietly, and the sound of it did something to the air in the room that he had no precise language for and no desire to analyze. He drank the tea she put in front of him without comment. He watched the frost on the grass through the kitchen window. He thought about the year ahead, about the work that was still left to do, about the questions that Dear Field study had opened that would take years to properly answer, about the juvenile wolf he had started tracking after Mara pointed her out, who was beginning to edge closer to the park's territory in a way that suggested she might be seeking integration. He also thought, quietly and with increasing frankness to himself, about what it would mean to ask Mara to stay. Not as a kitchen hand. Not as a subject of study. But as someone with a real role here, with work that matched what she was genuinely good at, the careful, sustained attention she brought to everything, the trust the wolves extended to her that no training or experience could manufacture, the way she moved through this landscape as though she had always been part of it. He did not ask her yet. He was not ready, and he did not think she was either, and he respected the distance that still existed between them even as it narrowed. He had learned, over years of working with wild animals, that the worst thing you could do with something building trust was to move too fast. That the most important quality in that process was not skill or knowledge but patience. The willingness to let the trust develop at its own rate and not reach for it before it was ready. He was applying this principle to himself and he was fully aware of the irony. February came and the hard freeze softened and the lock went from lock to loose and the first signs of the turning year appeared in the tree line, small changes, the kind that most people would not notice and that Maura noticed immediately. She pointed out to him one morning, on the walk back from the clearing, that the rowans at the northern edge of the woodland were starting to bud. He stopped and looked. She was right. 3 weeks ahead of last year's schedule. He wrote it in his field notes that evening and realized, when he looked at the entry, that she had made it into his field notes 4 times in the past month. Not as a subject of observation. Just as a fact, someone who had told him something true about the land that he had then verified. She was becoming part of his record of this place. He was not sure when that had happened, but he was not troubled by it. He simply noted it and moved on to the next entry. The pack continued to come to the castle wall each morning. Lena continued to arrive first. The young female Maura had spotted in the tree line had, by mid-February, begun to join the group in the clearing during the morning sessions, staying at the edge at first, then gradually moving closer over the course of several weeks, in the careful incremental way that real trust always moved. Dr. Field had extended her stay by 6 weeks and showed no particular urgency about leaving. She was writing a second paper, she said. The data was too rich to leave. On a Wednesday in the last week of February, Callum told Maura that he had a proposal he wanted to put to her. Not personally, he clarified, which he immediately recognized was a strange clarification that made things no clearer. Professionally, he said. About the estate. She looked at him with those careful, patient eyes. He said he had been thinking about the wildlife program, about how it was currently managed, about what it needed, about the gaps in it that had been obvious to him for years but that he had not had the right person to fill. He said that what the program needed was not another scientist or another handler, but someone whose relationship to the land was different from those things. Someone who understood it in a quieter way. Someone the animals trusted. He said it plainly, without preamble, the way she herself always spoke. Then he said, I'd like you to consider staying on in a different capacity. Not the kitchens. A role on the wildlife program, working alongside the field team, developing the observational work Dr. Field has started and that I believe you're better suited to continue than anyone I could bring in from outside. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm. The morning light was coming through the windows. From outside, faintly, came the sound of the groundskeepers beginning their day. You're serious, she said. I don't make professional proposals to people I'm not serious about, he said. She looked down at the counter. She seemed to be taking stock of something, turning it carefully in her hands the way she handled everything, without haste, without performance. I'd need to understand what it actually involves, she said. What I'd be responsible for. What the structure would look like. Of course, he said. And I'd need to know it was real, she said. That it was a real role. Not something created to keep me comfortable. He met her eyes. It is real, he said. I have needed it for 3 years. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. There was something in her expression then that she did not try to conceal, not exactly. She did not conceal things exactly. She simply kept them at a careful distance. But there was something there, behind the steadiness, that was warm. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 3 days. He did not push. He went back to his study and his maps and his field notes and his cold tea, and he waited the way he had learned to wait over years of working with things that moved at their own pace. On the 3rd day, she came to his study. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She stood in the doorway in the morning light and looked at him across the room. "Yes," she said. Simply and finally. "I'll stay." The role was real. He had not invented it to give her a reason, though the timing of its creation was entirely because of her. The need had been genuine and long-standing, a gap in how the estate managed its relationship with the rewarded species that no one had ever filled correctly, not because the right qualifications were lacking but because qualifications were not what the work actually required. She began in March. There was no formal ceremony, no introduction to the wider staff, no presentation. She was given a set of keys, a radio, a pair of proper field boots, and access to the observation records going back to the start of the rewilding project 9 years earlier. She read through them in the evenings, sitting in the small office adjacent to Dr. Field's field station, which had by then been converted into a permanent part of the estate's operation. She read carefully and made notes in her own handwriting in the margins, not corrections but questions, things she had noticed that the records did not account for, patterns that the data hinted at but had not fully traced. Callum reviewed her margin notes one evening when she had gone to supper. He stood at the desk and read through what she had written, and he felt the specific, rare satisfaction of discovering that someone understood something well. Her questions were precise. They were the right questions, the ones that the data had been quietly asking for years without anyone noticing. He left a note of his own on the top page. It said, "These are good. The top one has been on my mind since year 3. He thought about leaving it unsigned and then thought that was absurd and wrote his initial at the bottom. The next morning, her note was under his, "I think the answer is in the river data. I'll look at it this week." He read it twice. Then he put it in his field notebook, which was where he kept things he wanted to keep. The spring came properly in April, with warmth that arrived quickly and stayed, and the land around Ashford began to do what it did each year, unfold itself in a way that never stopped being extraordinary to him, no matter how many years he had watched it. The wolves pushed north again, following the deer, and the morning sessions in the clearing became afternoon sessions on the open moorland where the pack moved through the long gold light of April evenings. Moro moved with them. Not chasing, not directing, simply present in the landscape, moving at the pace the land allowed, and the wolves tolerated her presence in their territory with an ease that deer. Field documented and Callum observed directly, and neither of them quite had words for beyond what the data already showed. Lena, the dominant female, had begun to do something in April that Callum had never observed in any of his years with the pack. She would occasionally lead the group to a position that placed her between the rest of the animals and any unknown presence, the defensive positioning that dominant wolves used to manage threat. She had begun doing this specifically in relation to Mora. Not positioning herself between Mora and a threat, but positioning herself beside Mora, facing outward. She was, Dr. Field said quietly one evening, protecting her. Callum heard this and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Lena doesn't protect people." "No," Dr. Field said. "She doesn't. Until now." He thought about this for a long time. He thought about what it meant that his wolves, animals he had studied for years with the full resources of scientific method, had arrived at a conclusion about Mora that he had arrived at through entirely different means and that he still had not found the courage to say out loud. He found the courage on an evening in late April. They were walking back from the moorland after a long afternoon session, just the two of them, dear. Field had stayed behind to finish recording, and the light was doing what it did in April in the highlands, going golden and slow in a way that made the whole landscape look like something remembered rather than something present. He said her name. She looked at him. She had learned, by now, that when he said her name without following it with anything logistical, he was about to say something that mattered. He said he had been thinking about what she had told him in the autumn, about carrying two things at the same time, not expecting permanence but still wanting it. She was quiet, waiting. He said he wanted her to know that what she had built here was not temporary. Not the role, not the work. The role was genuinely hers, as permanent as anything on the estate, which was to say as permanent as he could make it. But that was not exactly what he was trying to say. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The moorland stretched around them in the evening light, and somewhere across the ridge the pack was moving, unseen but present, the way they always were. He said he had been learning, over the past months, that there were things about this land and this work that he had understood very well and things he had understood poorly, and that the thing he had understood most poorly was how much of what he had been building here had been missing something he had not known to name until she arrived and named it by existing. He was not saying this well. He knew he was not saying it well. He was better with data than with this kind of language, and he was aware of it in a way that was almost uncomfortable. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Are you trying to tell me something that isn't about the job?" He said yes. She said, "Then just say it." So he did. He said it simply and directly, the way she had always spoken to him, because she had taught him, without intending to, that the cleanest way to say something true was to say it without ornamentation. He told her that he did not want to be only her employer. He told her that he did not know with precision what the alternative looked like, but that he was certain he wanted to find out. He told her that he was saying this carefully and without pressure, and that her answer, whatever it was, would not change anything about her position on the estate or his respect for her or the way their mornings worked. He stopped talking. The wind moved across the moorland. A bird called from the direction of the loch. She was quiet for what felt like a very long time, but was probably less than a minute. Then she said, "I've been waiting for you to say something since January." He looked at her. She was looking at the ridge, where the light was going amber, and there was something in her profile that was entirely calm and also not quite hiding a smile. "January," he said. "You left a field guide on my hook in December," she said. "Without a note. And I left header on the window and you kept it. I saw you put it in your coat pocket. That was December." She paused. I thought January was a reasonable timeline. He had not known she saw him take the header. He thought about December and January and February and March and the whole of the spring, all the mornings walking back from the clearing and the evenings looking at maps and the notes in the field notebook margins, and he understood that she had been patient with him in the same way he had been patient with her, for the same reasons, and that the waiting had been mutual and the timing had been right. "You could have said something in January," he said. "So could you," she said. He had no argument against this. She was correct, as she was frequently correct. They walked back to the castle together in the evening light, and the moorland opened and closed around them, and somewhere on the hill above the ridge, though they could not see them, the wolves moved through the long gold of the April evening in the way they always did, easy and unhurried and entirely where they were supposed to be. Mara managed the estate's wildlife program from that spring forward. She had no formal degree, no letters after her name, no published papers. What she had was something that took most researchers years of deliberate practice to develop, and that she had simply always carried: the ability to be still in the presence of wild things, to observe without disturbing, to understand the language of animal behavior not as a system to be decoded but as something she had always been partly fluent in. She built a methodology over the following years that Dr. Field later described in a published retrospective as the most productive observational framework she had encountered in a career of 20 years. It was not complicated. It was grounded in patience and attention and the willingness to let the animal set the terms of every interaction. It was, in essence, what Mara had always done, what she had been doing in every kitchen and every job and every small room she had ever occupied, humming quietly and waiting for the world to come closer. The wolves continued to gather beneath the castle windows in the winters. Lena lived to 11 and remained dominant until her final year, when she passed the role to her eldest daughter with the kind of unhurried authority that had defined her from the beginning. The young female Mara had spotted at the tree line integrated fully into the park by the following autumn and was, years later, among the most studied animals on the estate. Callum stayed. He had always stayed, the estate was his life and had been for years, but staying took on a different quality after April. He was still quiet. He still preferred the hills to most other places and the company of his work to most other company. But the study in the evening was warmer than it used to be, and the kitchen before dawn had stopped being a place he arrived at and started being a place he came home to. The staff at Ashford Castle understood, collectively and without discussion, what had happened. They did not talk about it directly, because Callum would not have found that appropriate and Mara would have found it uncomfortable. But they understood. And there was, in the quiet daily life of the estate, a particular quality to the mornings, the early dark, the sound from the kitchen, the wolves settling in the frost beneath the window, that everyone who worked there felt without quite being able to describe. Something right. Something that had needed to find its place and had found it. The header column had taken from the windowsill in December stayed in his field notebook for years. The notebook was replaced when it filled, and then replaced again, but the header moved from one to the next. He never mentioned it. He did not need to. Maura knew. She had known since December. She had simply been waiting, the way she waited for everything, with patience, and with the quiet certainty that what was true would arrive in its own time, and that the best thing you could do was be still and keep humming, and let the world arrange itself around you in the way it always did when you stopped trying to force it and simply remained. And it did. As it turned out, it always did.